All right, thanks everyone. Sorry for the delay. Are we good on the AV side? Great. All right, so thanks for coming to this. We scheduled two 80-minute sessions. The first 20-ish minutes of both will be the same presentation. Sorry for people who are planning on coming to both, but it'll just be an overview of the OpenTelemetry project, which we didn't have time for at the keynote. And then in this morning session, we'll have a small panel of people from OpenTelemetry. We can certainly talk amongst ourselves, but hopefully, ideally, we'll get folks from the audience you all to participate, either by asking questions or by sharing your own experiences with this sort of technology. So I guess I'll get started. I'm Ben Sigelman. I'm one of the co-creators of OpenTracing, and I'm going to hand off to Spiros, who's been involved with OpenCensus for a while. Feedback, something. Thank you. To talk about the organization of OpenTelemetry. All right, so this is actually, Bogdan, did you get off the hook? You're not going to present anything right now? You're off the hook, right? Okay, good. Yeah, Bogdan will be here this afternoon to present, but now he's just watching because he doesn't like being on stage. So let's talk about OpenTracing and OpenCensus briefly. A quick show of hands. Are the people who here is doing some sort of tracing at your companies? Okay, so it's sort of like roughly half. And who's using OpenTracing right now? Who's using OpenCensus right now? Okay, so some of each. So both of these projects cover some part of this matrix. What I would emphasize is that telemetry in practice right now is some combination of distributed traces, metrics, and logs. My personal opinion is that distributed tracing is just kind of fancy logging. It's logging that's meant to understand transactions across a distributed system, so you can kind of group them together, and that's why it's natural to expand from tracing into logs. But if you don't have these basic data types, it's very difficult to observe a modern microservices-based application. Now, getting that telemetry isn't just a matter of like collecting the bits and bytes. There's also some instrumentation that's required, and a big part of the value proposition for OpenTelemetry and OpenTracing and OpenCensus before it is to do that instrumentation once and then reuse that effort across anyone who consumes a given framework or library. So for instance, if you're in Java and you depend on DropWizard, someone should instrument DropWizard for telemetry once, and then you should be able to use that instrumentation no matter what vendor open source project you're using to observe it. So there are APIs for that. There's also an implementation of like a telemetry SDK or library that actually sits in your application and collects the data and gets it out of the process. That's something that takes a lot of time and care to do well. OpenCensus has a nice set of implementations for this in many languages. There's infrastructure like collectors. The Omniscient folks who are here have done a lot of work on a very high quality kind of sidecar model. Is that fair, Spiros, for the OpenCensus collector? There are other things as well that can be built there. And then there are a bunch of formats. Several people in the room here were meeting in Barcelona prior to KubeCon as part of the W3C effort to standardize on what's a glorified HTTP header, but it's a very complicated and important HTTP header that they've spent, I don't know how many frequent flyer miles like over the last couple of years trying to get the details perfect. But there are a number of formats like that that actually are very difficult to get right, and telemetry involves those formats as well. So there's really a pretty wide scope. I think that's what I'm trying to say. You have several different domains. For the top two layers, you have to repeat this effort in every language that people actually depend on in production. It's a huge amount of work. And the OpenTelemetry project over time intends to have a footprint really across this entire spectrum, and that's the scope of what we're trying to accomplish. What's absent here are actual applications of the telemetry data. So that would be things like Jaeger or Prometheus in the open source world, or Zipkin. There are a number of vendors here. I won't take this opportunity to advertise my own company, but we all are trying to sell stuff that uses this data as well. And that's part of the reason that vendors are so interested in these projects, is that we want to have high quality data coming out of these cloud native applications, and without efforts like OpenTelemetry, that data just isn't there. But OpenTelemetry itself doesn't provide a user interface to speak of, or like a full solution. It's really just a portable way to get the data out of your system into other tools. Make sense? Cool. So OpenTracing and OpenCensus have been around for a while. OpenTracing was, I think, the most important thing to understand about it is actually what was problematic. OpenTracing was really restricted to tracing. So in that diagram from before, it was just one vertical slice, and it was also focused on just the API layer. The loose coupling and the small scope was helpful in that it was easy for people to adopt it in a way, but you would end up instrumenting your code once for tracing, once for metrics, and then again for logging, which was not great. OpenCensus addressed that issue. It had, it still has support for many verticals. It had tighter coupling between the implementation of the little SDK that gets data out of the process and the API, which made it a little bit more difficult for some vendors to adopt. And it also made it more difficult to add new languages. But both these projects have very wide adoption. Oh, yeah, so these are the the pain points that people felt with these two projects kind of highlighted here. I should say that by far the most painful thing about these projects was just that there are two of them, which we did say in the keynote. I mean, when we talked to users from OpenTracing, I know OpenCensus people felt similarly. The number one feature request was just to merge these projects, as the presence of two was incredibly problematic. There are a lot of people contributing to both. This is kind of good. You like to see things that are widely adopted, but also not so good in that we were unable to kill either project. Like, we could stop developing OpenTracing or OpenCensus, and the projects have enough velocity at this point that they would continue to exist. And so it's necessary for us to formally merge these two projects in order to have a way for them to develop into this third project. Yeah, so the ecosystem's confused and held back. Well, we can share these slides if people want them, but there's a Hadoop ticket where you can see, as they think about how to move HBase and HDFS over to OpenTracing or OpenCensus. And the discussion just resolved in them doing neither, because they couldn't decide which one to use. This is just a very public artifact of a discussion that we saw happening over and over again in the industry, where people couldn't figure out which project to use, and we want to make that easier for people by only having one. So yeah, this project is the next major version of both, and that's really the right way to think of it. It's designed for backwards compatibility, which we'll talk about in a minute, and it doesn't lock you into anything vendor-wise, nor does it make it difficult to continue to use OpenTracing and OpenCensus. So there's a very clear migration path, but OpenTracing and OpenCensus will both evolve into just being OpenTelemetry over the next year or two. So I think with that, I'll hand over to Spiros, and he'll tell you a bit about the project itself.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, my name is Spiros Xanthos. I am the founder of a vendor in this space called Omnition, who have also been contributors to OpenCensus since the early days. And just briefly, what I want to do is introduce what OpenTelemetry is, with more specific description of each of the components. For those of you who are familiar with either of the projects, really you can think of OpenTelemetry as a superset of OpenTracing and OpenCensus. So it does actually try to address initially tracing and metrics, really across pretty much all the layers, and eventually other types of telemetry. And do it in a way that, as Ben described, does not try also to solve the problem of analysis in the backend. And I think that's an important thing, because it remains totally vendor neutral, even when it comes to open source backends, which lets us focus on the actual instrumentation and how to do that the right way and in an open and, let's say, standards-based approach so that you instrument your code once, or we do that for frameworks, and we have it for free, and for all sorts of uses. So I'm going to go over the three main parts of OpenTelemetry briefly. So first, there is the Instrumentation API. So this actually derives from both OpenTracing and OpenCensus, with some changes from each one of them, really improvements from the lessons we had over all these years in developing against these APIs. I'm not going to go into the details of what those changes are. Some of them are breaking for both, but there's going to be compatibility with both via bridges that will be delivered together with OpenTelemetry. But anyway, this API aims to achieve, let's say, to build context propagation, tracing and metrics, and correlation between them, and eventually logs as well. The other big goal, obviously, of this is to rely on the existing adoption, let's say, and by open source frameworks and libraries, and broaden that, so that hopefully eventually get to a point where most open source, let's say, or popular frameworks are instrumented with OpenTelemetry, and we really get that for free as application developers. And for those maybe familiar with OpenCensus, the coupling in OpenCensus was much more tighter between the API and the implementation. As part of OpenTelemetry, we're creating a clean interface or a clean separation between the two. And I guess across different verticals as well, tracing, metrics, etc. OpenTelemetry is also going to have a, let's say, canonical implementation of all these APIs into client libraries, one for each popular language. Those will derive to a great extent from the existing OpenCensus implementation, which has been used in production for a while, and it's hardened, especially for the major languages. The OpenTelemetry libraries will support out of the box all the popular open source backends, say Jaeger and Zipkin for tracing, Prometheus for metrics. And also, we will use the W3C trace context for context propagation, and we'll have an open wire format for tracing metrics and logs. There is no really standard there, but that's also important, let's say, for openness and for future-proofing it. And finally, the OpenTelemetry project will also inherit the data collection infrastructure from OpenCensus, which is also used in production by quite a few users, and it's hardened. What we call the OpenCensus service today, and it's going to become the OpenTelemetry agent and collector, already supports all popular open source and even commercial backends for tracing and metrics primarily today. The agent helps in a few ways to, let's say, decouple some of, or remove some of the functionality from the client libraries, and have the client libraries be simpler and have a fewer things to worry about there. Most of the exporters are today live in the agent. And this has a few other advantages. For example, you can change where you send your data without having to restart the application, because that can be configured from the agent. You can, for standalone applications, let's say like Envoy, you can even actually have the instrumentation built into the binary, and you don't even have to recompile, because you can reconfigure where you send the data from the agent. And also there is even more advanced functionality, like for buffering retries, for tail-based sampling, that already exists in the collector service that will also be in OpenTelemetry. Also, as you can see here in the diagram, the agent already supports importers for existing formats. For example, let's say you're using Jaeger libraries with OpenTracing instrumentation, the collector can accept that, and it can merge it together, let's say, with OpenCensus or even OpenTelemetry instrumentation in the future, and direct all that data together, merge all the data and direct it back to whatever backend you want to use, even multiple backends at the same time. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ben to talk a bit about the goals and timelines and compatibility. Thank you.
All right. We're almost done with the static portion of this event. This is an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room for any project like this is this fantastic cartoon. I'm sure people are familiar with it if you've been on the internet in the last 10 years. But basically the joke is that there are 14 standards. We need to create a new standard to unify across them, and now we have 15 standards. Of course, here we're dealing with smaller numbers, but the problem still remains. This is like by far the most worrisome thing about this effort for any of the people involved in it is to avoid this situation. And the way that we're trying to do that, I mean, a lot of us have worked in this, I've worked in this space for 15 years now. I have a lot of ideas. I have a lot of regrets about OpenTracing, and I want to create a new project that's totally ideal, like greenfield, and we're not doing that. We're actually throwing out all of our hopes and dreams, squashing them under our feet, and creating a project that is solely like focused on backwards compatibility, which is like the least sexy thing to make your main design goal, but that's kind of the main design goal. The goals for the year are to make this backwards compatible. The way to avoid the standards issue from the XKCD cartoon is to have some kind of demonstrated enforceable technical backwards compatibility, and that's the main focus for OpenTelemetry until we've achieved this milestone of having both OpenTracing and OpenCensus in, oh, I guess this slide got messed up here, but basically they're going to be in like a sunset kind of read-only status where they still work, but we're not going to be making new changes to OpenTracing and OpenCensus, and there will be bridges to bring you into OpenTelemetry. As we're developing the OpenTelemetry APIs, we co-develop them with shims that are basically required to have OpenTracing and OpenCensus instrumentation accepted alongside OpenTelemetry instrumentation in the same process. We're also going to guarantee compatibility with OpenTracing and OpenCensus for 2 years after this kind of official read-only sunsetting of them later this year. So what this means in practical terms, if you want to actually instrument production software today, like literally today, you should still use OpenTracing or OpenCensus, and you're not going to get left in the dust. If you want to contribute to a project that's creating telemetry for everyone, then you should contribute to OpenTelemetry. Like I'd suggest active development on the APIs themselves should be focused on OpenTelemetry, but if you want to adopt tracing or metrics or whatever, you should continue to use OpenTracing and OpenCensus probably for the summer. Our goal in the long term, obviously, is to have only one project to avoid the XKCD scenario and to have this broad surface area. And we want to have, and we already do have very open governance, so the people who are here today are basically the people who could fly out here, but we have a governance model that's actually essentially lifted from Kubernetes with 9 different seats that will be elected, no benevolent dictators for life, a lot of rotation, requirements about the maximum representation from any one vendor, et cetera, et cetera. So this project will be safe from the influence of any sneaky vendors trying to move it in one direction or another, and I think will hopefully be a model of how projects like this can be administered just from a ecosystem standpoint. Yeah, so I think that's, I just scooped myself. If you want to read about this stuff, you can. I did want to make a little plug for this. If this stuff sounds fun, I think it's fun, but I'm super biased. You can easily become a contributor to OpenTelemetry. There's a lot of work to do given this incredibly wide scope of the project, and we'd love to have more members involved. And really, there's probably, I think, 9 or 10 languages we're targeting this year, something like that. There's a lot of work to do, and it's pretty fun. So if you want like a spare time project, we have work for you. It's not difficult if you can become an active contributor to become a member and then an approver and a maintainer for either a language or some aspect of the project. I already said this stuff. And I think that's it. Any quick questions about this stuff? We're about to do a much longer panel discussion, so if you have broad questions, forget it. We'll just have the panel. So let's see. I don't think Isabel's here yet, is she? I don't see her. We'll have one more person joining us, but several of us will sit down here, and I hope people are willing to ask questions or even just share your own experiences with this type of stuff. But we'll spend the remaining roughly hour just having a conversation about all this sort of technology. But thanks for paying attention for the presentation part. Cool. Hello? Okay, cool. So who's actually joining for this?
I will join.
Cool.
Do we need a laptop?
No. All right, so we've got myself, Ben, Bogdan, Spiros, or which one of you is going to do this? Steve, and Morgan, and then Isabel will be here soon. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves? I guess we just sit down or something.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bogdan, and I work for Google. I work in this area for more than 7 years right now, and I was the one who who created the OpenCensus project by open sourcing a lot of the technology that Google had available for a long time.
Hi, my name is Steve Flanders. I'm head of product and experience at the startup Omnition with Spiros, and been working in the observability cloud native space for a while, previously at VMware working on log analytics, and now helping contribute to OpenCensus, the collector, agent, and client libraries.
I'm Morgan McClean from Google. I'm a product manager on OpenCensus and some of our developer and ops products for our customers. Like Bogdan, I've been with OpenCensus since the beginning, which means I do what Bogdan tells me to do.
Yeah, so I really hope people are going to ask questions. Otherwise, this is going to be incredibly boring. Who wants to ask something? Or you can just say something if you want to do that, too. This is a small enough group that we should be able to do that.
We can do trivia, too.
Yeah, trivia is good. Anyone?
So that you were standardizing the W3C propagation headers, but there are a lot of things in between if you have like a service-to-service call, like a mesh, and maybe they don't standardize on those, but are also using those headers. Are there options to force it to another one, or are you talking to the mesh people to standardize? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, we will. Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, I am. The question was about context propagation headers, and particularly in reference to the W3C header. And I think you'd also asked, obviously we're standardizing on this, but will other things involved in the path of some of your requests, like proxies or other components, will they interact with this, and will they also standardize on it? I think there's two aspects to this. The first is, yes, I think a lot of them will. Like, the reason that we pursued putting a header in an organization like the W3C instead of just defining it within OpenTelemetry or OpenCensus was to give it even more credibility for the designers of network hardware, designers of proxies, designers of any other systems that interact with your requests. And so I think just based on conversations we've had with people like Matt Klein at Lyft, for example, who maintains Envoy, a lot of them were hoping and anticipating this for a long time. So I'm pretty confident that you're going to see a lot of vendors and open source suppliers play ball with this format, if only because they wanted one and they've been waiting for it. Secondly, I think you also made mention of mixed mode environments where you might have pieces of your application that use other headers. Obviously, I think I know in OpenCensus and I think in OpenTracing you had options to change the header that you used. OpenCensus historically by default used the W3C format. But you can go use the Zipkin format or something else if you want. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. I don't know how good our support is for using two at the same time, but outside of that, it's mostly a solved problem.
I'd add one more thing to that too. I mean, I'm not sure if you were also implying that there are things that happen that can't be captured just by the header, like you might want to understand the timing in the service mesh. Is that the sort of thing you're getting at as well?
Yeah, so what we thought, like, we could, like, have HTTP propagation from our application to Istio, and everything merged together. Some part was OpenCensus, some part was Istio. If you, like, Istio doesn't support, I don't know, one of those components doesn't support it, you actually lose your complete image.
I see, yeah. So the concern is that if something drops the W3C header along the way, then you break your traces. That's the basic concern. Yeah, I mean, I would emphasize what Morgan said. I mean, as far as I can tell, the support for W3C, it's important for projects like OpenTelemetry to embrace it, but it's not to the exclusion of other ways of propagating context around. It is the challenge for distributed tracing is actually context propagation. The tracing part where you record timing and all that isn't nearly as difficult as getting the context propagated everywhere. So I don't want to minimize the effort that's involved, but it's not so much about formats, it's more about code just correctly taking stuff from ingress and following it through to egress. Like that's the part that's been really challenging, and I believe that, at least to the best of my knowledge, there's no particular reason that an intermediary that doesn't use that specific format couldn't be compatible with this effort. They would just need to kind of propagate a string from place to place, if that makes any sense. But next, another question. Does that work question-wise? Okay.
Yes. We have a greenfield projects. We will host a lot of machine learning microservices like Kubernetes, and the target for running Kubernetes will be multi-cloud and on-prem. I'd like to get some guidance from you guys to see where's our starting point for this greenfield project in terms of adopting OpenTelemetry. Shall we start? Our strategy is that we start with the logs, then move to metrics, then do some of the advanced distributed tracing. So this is kind of our 3 steps. And in terms of maturity and code readiness, if we want to try out this OpenTelemetry based on the pace the community come out with, what it would be your recommendation? Should we start with OpenTrace, OpenCensus, or OpenTelemetry?
So, I mean, today, I'll repeat the question, so thank you. So the question is around, have a greenfield project, microservices base, looking to add observability, telemetry data, including logs, metrics, and traces. If you're just getting started, what should you use? Should you use OpenTelemetry? Should you use OpenCensus? Should you use OpenTracing? What are your options? So today, OpenTelemetry is not ready yet to consume. You can definitely contribute to it. There's the Java client library is being ported over right now, so some of that is up and available in the repo.
Yeah, just add a little context. Yep. Our 3 languages, C#, Python, and Java and Go.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's 4 of the 5 top languages that OpenTracing and OpenCensus support today, and will be 4 of the 5 top languages that will be in OpenTelemetry to start with as well. The goal is to get those to production-ready quality by the September date that was listed on the milestones in the slide previously. So that will be coming soon, and you should definitely stay abreast of those changes and get involved in the community. But if you're looking to get started today, like if you're like, I need traces or metrics today, then your options are OpenTracing and OpenCensus. Both of them provide a rich ecosystem and rich integrations depending on the languages that you're using and the frameworks that you rely on. Both of them will offer a bridge. So if you leverage either one of them today, you will have a way to get to OpenTelemetry, and it will be backwards compatible. So that's kind of critical. It means that you're not going to be wasting effort even if you do use OpenTracing or OpenCensus today. It will fully work with OpenTelemetry. There will be work necessary to make that transition to the OpenTelemetry libraries eventually once the sunsetting is complete, but you have time to do that. So it sounds like in your case you want to start with logs, then go to metrics, then go to traces. In that case, one option that you have is OpenCensus because it'll give you the metrics aspect, but you could still use OpenTracing for the tracing aspect when you get to that step. There's no reason why you can't use both, right? So it comes down to what your business requirements are going to be in terms of priorities. Typically, from a microservices standpoint, we often see the opposite. Most people start with traces as the foundation. And actually, before even traces is context propagation, like we were talking about earlier, because just enabling context propagation allows you to do correlation and context of your microservices-based architecture, whether you use traces, metrics, or logs. And then you can actually enrich the data. So you can add like tracing information, the trace ID, span ID, into logs. That's very powerful. So I'd say that nothing prevents you from getting involved today. There's plenty of resources out there, and all the communities are very active on Gitter or Slack. But today, your options are OpenTracing and OpenCensus, and very soon we'll start porting libraries starting with Java, and you can start taking advantage of that for OpenTelemetry. Anyone?
I have maybe an add-on question, if you don't mind. Our customer is a lot of our enterprise customers. They are typically bundled with some traditional APM products, such as the dynaTrace, AppDynamic, and those and so forth, New Relics, and for that if we offer OpenTrace-based logs, how we would be able to start to interact with those traditional commercial version of the logs and
We'll introduce Isabel in a second, who just joined us. Well, I totally, so you haven't said, so your company, yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the question. You're asking how your customers are often using some kind of a traditional APM. You mentioned dynaTrace, AppDynamics, New Relic, and I think you're wondering if you adopt OpenTracing, OpenCensus, whatever, are your customers going to be able to see through your software in their own APM? Is that correct? We have some distinguished guests from dynaTrace who are here with us today. Do you want to take that question? Just hopefully you'll say yes.
So I work at dynaTrace, and that is our goal. So we are bringing ourselves actively into the development of OpenTelemetry, because the goal is that even though we use dynaTrace, which uses fully automatic instrumentation, you can also augment this with manual instrumentation with OpenTelemetry, and this should go together and merge together, and you should see this also in our product. That's on our roadmap, yes. Okay.
He said yes. Last thing I'll add just briefly, it sounds like your software is being basically shipped on-prem or in a VPC or whatever. I would love to see us get to a point where black box SaaS is also partially instrumented so that you can see through, at least to understand how it's working. That involves standards that haven't been proposed yet, but that would be great. Can we just take a quick break to introduce Isabel? Do you want to just...
Hi there, last minute edition. I'm Isabel Rettelmeyer. I work with Ben at LightStep. So I'm an open source engineer working on OpenTracing and now OpenTelemetry, and also the W3C standards like trace context.
Yes, hi. Could you talk a little bit about the choice of sort of sunsetting OpenTracing and OpenCensus and doing something new, as opposed to evolving those two projects into the new thing instead of having two separate projects?
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that? So the question was about the choice to turn OpenCensus and OpenTracing into OpenTelemetry versus continuing to evolve the existing projects. And it's interesting you asked that. Like, certainly when we started having conversations late last year about what we should do to work together better, one of the options that came up was, hey, we'll adopt the same API but keep two separate projects. And I think that could have been a reasonable option. I think there were a number of benefits of doing a complete merger. One was we wouldn't be sharing a dependency across projects, which can be annoying when different projects want to version things at different times. It makes sure everything stays in sync. The other was, like, frankly, between both these projects, the W3C group and others, like, it's mostly the same people who've been working on all these things. Like, it was already trending towards a single community, and it was kind of arbitrary that the two projects were divided. Personally, I view this as the most optimal outcome, the complete merger, because it means there's no division of sort of goals or sort of, you're less likely to get certain people going off on tangents or taking the projects further away because they're involved in a single community with a single governance board and everything else. Yeah.
Also, from an instrumentation perspective, it makes it easier to add instrumentation for now OpenTelemetry, previously OpenTracing or OpenCensus, into existing libraries and frameworks. So if you want to add instrumentation to MySQL or Hadoop or Kubernetes now, previously there was kind of this big question of, okay, should they go with OpenTracing or OpenCensus? The idea is that now there's kind of one canonical choice rather than this ambiguous option of one or the other. Another question?
Hi. Operation name, it's sort of the forgotten tag. It doesn't have a HTTP header, it's not forwarded, but we find it really useful because what we do is we take dynaTrace fuel path data, we map it to an operation name and use the fuel path ID as the trace ID, and that gives us metrics so that we know how long all of our API calls or any call goes, and then we apply AI to that to be able to look for things that are out of the ordinary across 30 days of data. But operation name isn't forwarded in the headers as a standard yet. Are you thinking of doing that in the future?
Repeat the question.
Okay. So to summarize the question, because yeah, the question was if we are thinking to propagate operation name in the trace context, and it's an interesting use case that I've never heard so far. It's the first time when I'm hearing about this use case.
I've heard some use cases regarding it.
Okay, yeah. So definitely, if we have good use cases, I think that should be possible, especially that the trace context has a special part called trace state, where we can insert anything that we want. It's a key value representation that we can definitely add the operation if it's useful.
Not headers, but something we've also kind of started talking about informally and that we should move to a slightly more formal discussion soon is having kind of more standard patterns for operation names so that, for example, all HTTP clients would kind of be expected to have, let's say, HTTP method path or something like that. Not necessarily that exact pattern, but something rather than, some having that pattern, some having just HTTP, some having just the method. Something more consistent across libraries or frameworks.
Sorry, so context operation is a key aspect of tracing, right? Is there any kind of, I don't expect early, but is there any plans on standardizing context itself, not context operation between services, but a context object just like we have in Go, right? Because with that you can probably just optimize instrumentation and expose libraries to make use of this very slim, very neutral API instead of the whole
So the question was if we are thinking to standardize on a context API that is going to be used mostly inside an application, correct? Not on the wire, because that's the trace context that we are talking about. And so we in general we try to work with the best thing that language offers. For example, as you mentioned, Go has a notion of a context very well defined that we have to use that one. Recently, Python added the convar. It's called. I think it's since 3.6. It has a very nice context definition. C#.NET has its own definition of this. So in all these languages, we are not trying to reinvent the wheel, and if the language has support, definitely we're gonna use that one. The biggest problem and the biggest beast probably is Java, where there is nothing. That's where we try to come up with a small, light API for this, and I think there is a discussion on issues in OpenTelemetry Java. Yuri also wrote a document about this thing, so feel free to participate in this discussion. But in the end, for languages that we don't have a context, we have to have a package called context that user can use, and other applications or other libraries can also share the same context.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether you're planning on switching that specific part of the API into an external library. So that if I'm a framework developer, like I develop projects, it's an asynchronous framework.
Yeah.
I would not want to make my users depend on OpenTelemetry, but only on that specific object.
Does it matter for you the namespace, or just the fact that it's just an artifact, a standalone artifact? For example, in Java, would you mind? Would you like to see that as a completely standalone project, or just a complete standalone artifact will be good enough for you?
First of all, I want to say I totally agree with you that the context should be split out. When I was saying that after 15 years, blah, 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 like if I could just do everything all over again, there would be like a dedicated project that just does context, regardless if it's called OpenTelemetry context or whatever. I think the backwards compatibility thing gets to be a little bit of issue, especially in some of these languages where it's difficult to get like a polyglot 9+ language thing that works the same way and supports like a truly general purpose context thing. There's a paper called Pivot Tracing that was an academic paper that describes a very beautiful like model based on a standard context object. I think we have tried to factor it out as its own. From just a code dependency standpoint, the context stuff is like the base layer that everything else is built around. I don't actually recall whether or not we're building out like a separate jar file for context or not, but
yeah, we haven't decided.
We haven't decided, yeah. I mean, I would love to see it move in that direction. I think in terms of like the project from a technical standpoint, we would like to see that thing take no dependencies and be as small as possible. In actual fact, I'm not sure if it's going to be possible in September to depend on OpenTelemetry, just the context piece without bringing in spans and all that kind of stuff as well. I'm not sure if that will be feasible, but in terms of technical direction, I do think that we're in agreement with your overall philosophy, which is totally sensible, I think.
So what's the relationship between OpenTelemetry and the OpenMetrics project? Honestly, I'm not, at the moment, I'm not quite sure how far along that project is, but is the intention to support OpenMetrics out of the box, if possible?
You want to take that?
Yeah. The question was, what's the relationship between OpenTelemetry and OpenMetrics? And
OpenMetrics actually is.
That's a good thing. Everyone knows about OpenMetrics? Okay. So OpenMetrics aim to be a project that's standardized on wire format for metrics. And is mostly a combination of folks from Prometheus and from Stackdriver monitoring. So far, there is no real activity on that project. There is not yet a format proposed by them, but definitely we would support that format once that is available. So there is another problem that they haven't defined a protocol. They just define a format, which is a bit of a problem for us to say that we support it, because there is no way to test that you support it, essentially. If you don't have a protocol, you just have a format. But in general, we try to follow that repo very closely, and if they will have a format and a protocol, we will definitely want to support that.
Should I take that as the OpenTelemetry will be a superset to include OpenMetrics?
No. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really dangerous if, given the slide we showed about OpenTelemetry's scope, if we now say we're going to absorb every project that touches on any of that stuff, I think we would spend all of our time making people very angry on Twitter. So it's not our intention to strong-arm anyone into like becoming part of OpenTelemetry. I think if there are formats that we can adopt that would make it easier to adopt OpenTelemetry, then we'll adopt them. So I think I'm actually friends with some of the people who started OpenMetrics, and I'd like to see them succeed. If they succeed under whatever flag they want to fly, that's great, and we can adopt the formats they've created.
Then we have an issue for our greenfield project is the target multi-cloud. Right now, we split up a lot of metrics in the cloud-native ways in GCP and AWS. There are cloud-specific metrics. So moving forward for our on-prem, how are we going to maintain this sort of cloud-agnostic and open?
How are you going to maintain something that's cloud-agnostic without, well, I didn't quite understand the question. What is the thing that you need to have happen?
Our telemetry is very cloud-dependent, if you wish, because in Google Cloud we do SkyDriver, in AWS we do AWS.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, because just the actual names of things in Google Cloud and I see. So OpenMetrics does not solve that problem, is the first thing I should say. I mean, OpenMetrics, as Bogdan was saying, is really, it's like a protocol, no, not a protocol, it's a format without a protocol to describe the transfer of metric data. It doesn't say a word about what metrics should be called or anything like that. What you're describing is very valuable, I think, especially in the world we live in where there are 3 or 4 like major public clouds that aren't going to go away, and you port your application from one to the other or at both at the same time and everything breaks. That sort of standardization it's exactly the sort of thing I'd like to see OpenTelemetry be involved in. I just want to make sure that people don't misunderstand our intention to dictate how everything works across the entire industry. I think we would love to be a home for that sort of effort to make sure that people refer to any aspect of container health with the same language. That sounds like an OpenTelemetry initiative to me, but if someone else does it first, we'll happily adopt that terminology. But OpenMetrics isn't going to solve the problem you just described, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes?
In this microservice ecosystem, in the end you have, for instance, infrastructure, you have network, you have applications, and one important thing from the observability is to have correlated all these points. So in the end, is when you ask for an APN, is because you have all the correlation between metrics, because tracing, logs, work. What is the point of the OpenTelemetry according to have this correlation between applications between metrics, logs related with infrastructure? What is this big ecosystem that's OpenTelemetry?
Any one of us could take that.
Might make more sense.
Yeah.
We go around. All right, I'm going back. Great. So I think the general question is around what is OpenTelemetry trying to solve, right? I mean, in a microservices distributed architecture, context and correlation is critical. Distributed tracing provides that. But, I mean, how do you tie this into metrics and logs and get value out of all this data? I think there's a few things that OpenTelemetry is trying to focus on. One is standards of how you actually record this and collect this data. All telemetry data. So it's going to start with traces and metrics, but then logging will come in as well. So the idea would be like for traces, the W3C trace context header format will be the de facto standard. There are other ones up there, Zipkin, Jaeger, you can use those. That's fine. That will be supported by OpenTelemetry as well. But there'll be best practices of, like, if you're starting in a greenfield environment, you should probably be looking at the W3C standard first. That is the one that most people are going to be consolidating on. The other aspects around data collection in general, so like client libraries or integrations into different frameworks. Instead of having like OpenCensus and OpenTelemetry, where if the Hadoop example was great, which one do I add? Now it's not a question. You add OpenTelemetry. That's the one you're going to add. And that will be the standard that's available. And then with something like the OpenTelemetry service, which will be coming soon, that actually handles translations into and out of different formats. So it's okay if you send Zipkin to it from one application, but Jaeger to it from another application. It'll handle that translation for you as long as your context propagation is the same. So if you're using Zipkin B3 headers, for example, that would work for you.
And I just want to add a bit onto that, just specifically on the topic of correlation. So This is something that we, like, specifically just like the Google contributors, just for reasons on the Google Cloud, like we are very, very interested in at the moment. Historically, various APM tools have often struggled with correlation where you get a metric, but then jumping for traces related to that metric is not always easy. It is on some of them, but it's not on all. Or even correlating things like a system metric to an application metric, right? Like the latency of an endpoint to the machine, machines that were actually sending that data and correlating that with like the CPU consumption of those machines. We are doing work like right now in the OpenCensus agent, which is going to move into OpenTelemetry, to make that a lot easier, whether it's being able to get exemplar traces out of things like a latency metric, so you can actually get that like hard linkage there, to ensuring that the resources that we capture system metrics from with the agent are well defined, and those are also correlated with traces and metrics coming out of your application. Because you're right, like at the moment the correlation story is not so great. We've done a bit of work historically in OpenCensus, we've done some work to get logs correlated with traces. But the whole like resource story has been like super wishy-washy for a while, which is why we're trying to fix that.
It's a really good question, and I mean, you're kind of asking what's the value prop here anyway? Like generating a bunch of data doesn't deliver any business value unless there's some kind of APM or whatever that takes that and, I don't know, answers an actual question about the relationship between CPU and latency. Is that correct? My restating of your question? Yeah. Yeah.
There's communication, maybe there is a network issue, so this correlation between the different points.
Yeah, totally.
Because in the end, when you work with open source solution, this correlation is super difficult. Like you work with Prometheus, OpenTracing, and Elastic, the correlation for troubleshooting is super difficult. So I was asking about that for OpenTelemetry, if in the end they are collecting metrics and traces from the application, extracting metrics from the application, not only application, from sensor in CPU, maybe you are having some kind of correlation between them. So
yeah. So there's two things I just wanted to, that's good. So to restate what you're saying, that there are many different dimensions that one might want to correlate across between these different flavors of telemetry data in order to explain application behavior, and that right now if you deploy Jaeger, Prometheus, Elastic, whatever, it's actually really hard to do that. Is that fair? So I just wanted to, in addition to everything that we've already said, that part of the reason that we have many different vendors that are involved with OpenTelemetry is, and we're all trying to, as vendors, we're trying to solve that problem. I don't mean OpenTelemetry, but like our commercial products, we're trying to solve that problem. And at the moment, the data stream that's coming out of these applications is insufficient to do what you're describing in some cases. I think that they're missing join keys, basically. What you're basically talking about is a join. Like you want to join metrics and traces, for instance, and the keys that you would join on this literally aren't present in a lot of the data that we get. So you can do things like AI, like the earlier question, although it would be a lot easier if the data was cleaner. So I think part of the idea with OpenTelemetry is to generate a much cleaner signal that has the necessary information in it so that we can even build that stuff. I like the open source ecosystem in many ways, but the fact that we've factionalized metrics, traces, and logs as 3 separate tools is a huge problem. A huge problem. It's fine from a data standpoint, but from a solution standpoint, it results in the pain point you're referring to. And part of the reason open source has had trouble addressing that is that the data stream itself is dirty and uncorrelated. And I do think that OpenTelemetry can help with that while still maintaining portability across projects and vendors. So I think part of the issue with the siloization of the solution is that the data stream isn't very good. So I think OpenTelemetry will help by generating a higher quality data stream with better correlation embedded in it. And then I think we'll see open source add integration features once the data is available. But right now, just the data itself is insufficient. So that's where OpenTelemetry, I think, will help with that. Does that make any sense? Cool. I just want to make sure we get good coverage.
The question is about the GRPC compatibility for OpenTracing. I don't know if you plan to support this compatibility, how you are going to support it. If you are going to the interceptors and stuff like that.
So
The question was, how do we plan to support GRPC? Okay. So the way how we plan, so GRPC is a critical product for Google as well, and as you know, I work for Google as well. So the way how we plan to do it, GRPC already has integration with OpenCensus natively in Java and C++, and we'll add in all the languages because we use it internally in Google. The plan how we do to do the transition will be via the same path that we will use for all the users. So we're going to talk in the next session about the transition plan, but essentially we want to move to change OpenCensus libraries to point to the OpenTelemetry, so that way easily GRPC will start not forwarding everything to OpenTelemetry. And then we will, essentially, at one point, we'll replace the code in GRPC to use OpenTelemetry, but for the transition period, it will still use OpenCensus.
Just going back to the correlation question, I work for LightStep, I should say upfront. We've been working on something called the elastic common schema, and I know the Google folks have also been looking at that. And it's our attempt to try and standardize. It's public, it's open source, you can go and look. It's our attempt to try and standardize on basically a set of fields that you should use for common things. And if more people used it, hopefully we end up in a place where we can start to correlate data much.
How's it called?
The elastic common schema.
Yeah.
And this also is something that we're looking at for OpenTelemetry, this being more standardization. So there are some discussions on GitHub there right now. I think we're going to be moving that to, again, a more formal RFC or something soon, but like this is being discussed.
Also on that, are you guys also talking to other projects like Bengaluru that they have like this idea that observability is all about spans, and it kind of matches OpenTracing that part, because OpenTracing emits logs, so it's not a third API, but then we derive metrics from spans, right? So span itself is a data point.
There's only one microphone in this room, sorry. I also, can I repeat for the recording, what was the Elastic project called?
Elastic common schema.
Elastic Common Schema. So Veneur, and whether there's a plan to integrate OpenTracing there. I don't speak for Veneur, but I do know the people on that project from Stripe. And I know they were very excited to hear about the OpenCensus, OpenTracing merge in general. So I'd imagine that they would be enthusiastic about support for this project, but I don't want to commit them to something without them being here, but I think that they would support it, yeah.
So when I understood you correctly, one of the plans is actually to make OpenTelemetry as a kind of a standard instrumentation library for tracing and metrics and all of that. Are you also trying to convince vendors that already do their own stuff, like Instana or dynaTrace, which also have their own instrumentation tooling kind of thing? Are you also convincing them to migrate over to OpenTelemetry, or is this something completely out of scope and you're just focusing on developers and hoping they're using it?
So the question is about whether we're trying to actively petition, you said force, I'll say petition, vendors like dynaTrace, Instana, et cetera, to adopt our APIs instead of or in addition to their own. Certainly no coercion is involved. I think dynaTrace is interested in participating in this effort. Most vendors, and certainly speaking for myself as a vendor or as someone who works at a vendor, I'm a human being, not a vendor. Sorry, really tired. I flew in yesterday from California. There's very little joy in trying to instrument the entire world as a vendor, and we can spend a lot of resources doing that. So I think most vendors would actually like to get out of the instrumentation business and focus on building their solutions. So typically, we don't feel like we have to strong-arm anyone. I think if these projects develop traction, it's not that difficult to bind to them. So what we saw with OpenTracing and OpenCensus was pretty wide support from vendors that had reasonable staffing, because it's usually like a relatively low lift to integrate with these things. But I don't think that we're expecting any vendor to orphan and ignore their own integration. This is just considered additive. So typically they'll say we support OpenTelemetry and OpenCensus and OpenTracing and Open whatever and our own thing and everything else, and then we get all the data into our solution. So I don't think we'll see OpenTelemetry replacing the manual instrumentation and dynaTrace, for instance. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think we'll see it being supported. Is that fair? Nodding from dynaTrace. Okay, good. Yes.
Just a follow-up question. So, for example, Google is doing this with Chromium, for example. They have the Chromium project, and several vendors are building their browsers on top of that, so including Google itself. Could this also be a direction for OpenTelemetry to say, okay, we're building a foundation, and so vendors can actually use OpenTelemetry as a foundation for building instrumentation?
We're going to stay out of the web browser business, I think. Sorry, Bogdan, can you repeat?
Yeah, the question was if vendors can use OpenTelemetry as a foundation and build their automatic or magical experience instrumentation on top of OpenTelemetry. I think ideally I would like to see this, and I think ideally that will also help them because they will have less code to maintain. But realistically speaking, I think there is a lot of investment that they did in that code, and it will be very hard for them to switch. But ideally, yes, that will be the ideal world. I think the new vendors, especially LightStep, Omniscient, and all these new vendors, that's what they are doing, essentially. But for more established vendors like dynaTrace, New Relic, Datadog, and all the very well-established vendors, I think they will have a bit of a hard time to do that, especially for the complexity of the code that they have. But we would like that to happen, and we will help them if they are committed to do that.
Isabel wants to say something. I also realized I couldn't see, you were occluded by another person, but we have a New Relic representative here too, if you want to say, do you want to say anything? Oh, that's right. Hey, what's up? Sorry. Either you want to say anything about this?
Save our life and not have to repeat. All right. I agree with everything being said. We're super interested in making it really easy to get telemetry out of applications so that we can do really interesting stuff with that data inside our SaaS solution. So we support OpenTelemetry, and we're really looking forward to that being something that reduces your burden and our burden as well. As far as using like OpenTelemetry agents or those things as a base, we'll see. I think right now we have things like security, account mechanisms that we need to pay a lot of attention to that aren't necessarily concerns for an open source project. So maybe in the future that there will be hooks for that, and we'll think about it.
And just reframing it a bit also, so Ben mentioned before that instrumentation is just a really, really big job. And right now with kind of each vendor doing the same instrumentation, again, but with their own vendor-specific agents and so on, it's kind of counterproductive for all of us. So I think that rather than petitioning vendors to use OpenTelemetry, it's more about incentivizing them. We might petition them to help staff us with resources, or particularly humans. But I don't think that it's about petitioning them to drop their agents per se, just about incentivizing them to have this fully fledged alternative.
Though if they do want to contribute those agents to the open source project, we'd be happy to accept it. Yeah. Or actually, sorry, yeah, Alex.
actually, the integration with the APMs, where does it happen now? Because OpenCensus has in-processor integration. Will that also be possible in OpenTelemetry, or is it all
Yeah, so it takes both OpenTracing and OpenCensus. So it maintains the OpenCensus implementation and the exporter interface for APM vendors that want to just provide an exporter and have OpenTelemetry do all the heavy lifting. But like OpenTracing, you can also just, if you're an APM vendor, you can also just bind against the APIs that are normally used for instrumentation and provide your own implementation and provide your own tracer and just go from there.
So to clarify on that, we took the lessons from the two projects and we understood how important it is to have a standard artifact just for the API perspective. So we'll have a pure API artifact, and then we'll have a standard implementation provided by the OpenTelemetry, which will be very close to what OpenCensus provides today with the exporters and in-process selection of the vendor if you want. We're also going to offer the agent solution. So if you want to use as a sidecar, and that's useful as during the presentation Spiro said, for example, in case of HBase or Envoy, where they may not want to allow you to do dynamic loading of exporters or anything like that. So they will say, hey, we're going to export using the OpenTelemetry protocol, and then the sidecar will, everyone will deploy the product with the sidecar where they can choose whatever vendor they want to expose this telemetry to. I will take this because it's again from Google part. We are in a huge amount of discussion with Istio. Unfortunately, they have a big deadline for July, but after July, we'll try to move everything to OpenTelemetry. So they will move to us with everything. And we are also not ready with OpenTelemetry until July, so it's a good timing. On GitHub, open-telemetry. Open-telemetry. Because the OpenTelemetry account is taken. What? I don't know.
No comment. Yeah, it's difficult to get a GitHub name that's already taken, it turns out. Even if it's completely dormant, has no commits, it's still really difficult to get. If anyone knows anyone at GitHub and they want to do us a favor, try to convince them to release OpenTelemetry. But Open-Telemetry on GitHub has a Java repo that actually has a lot of activity in it, and you can see where things are at.
Also now specification repo.
Oh yeah, specification repo.
We have a lot of repos, but the most active ones are Java and .NET right now. Yeah. There is Austin from LightStep, and Python has not started yet. They will start next week.
It's on a pretty short timeline, the whole thing. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Thanks everyone for your patience. Oh yeah, right. And then after lunch there will be another session. Other questions? All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and please find us online. We don't come out here too often, and it's great to meet everyone in person. So thanks again.